Alta Hope Church Adult Ed. One of the great things about being at Hope Church and in Holland, Michigan is our proximity to all the talent at Hope College. And we're going to harvest some of that talent in the next month. In 2 weeks, my religion colleague, Angela Carpenter, is going to be doing a 2-session presentation on religion and grace and social ethics, previewing a new book project that she's working on. And today, our guest is Dr. Kate Finley. Kate is an unusual academic. She's a philosopher with undergraduate and PhD from the University of Notre Dame, which is a source of a lot of great philosophy. But she's unusual in that she doesn't stay in her academic and her philosophical silo. She loves to communicate her wisdom to people beyond the academic world. She's taken her teaching and her instruction out into homeless shelters, prison, various community groups, here at Hope Church Adult Ed, obviously. And she's also unusual in that she takes the insights and the wisdom and the methodology of her discipline, philosophy, and connects it to other fields, such as religion and social ethics, disability, and my field of psychological and cognitive science. And so she teaches the philosophy of mind, and she's interested, as we'll see today and next week, in mental disorders and the connection of mental disorders and religion. So she's interested in both cognitive science and religion, and through this work on philosophy, mental disorders, and religion, she's bringing those into conversation. So I just thought, this is really interesting. She's an unusual, interesting person, and I raised the possibility of inviting her to our adult ed committee, and they responded with enthusiasm. And so, Kate Finley, it's great to welcome you to another place called Hope Church.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
Thanks for having me. All right. Also, how do I move to the next slide? Is there a clicker? Or no?
I've got it here. I can do it.
Okay.
So I'll find a clicker, but otherwise I'll do it for you.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Can you go back to the first slide? Okay. Thank you. All right. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm really excited to talk to you about all of this today. I always have to say these are the funders of this research I've done. So Hope and Calvin, John Templeton Foundation, and then another organization, Blueprint 1543. But a couple things. So one, if you have any questions as I'm going along, definitely feel free to just raise your hand or shout it out. I'll leave plenty of time for questions and discussing things at the end. And also, as Dave mentioned, I'm a philosopher, which means I argue with people for a living. So if you have an objection or a critical question, I'm totally down with that too. So feel free to just throw it at me. We can go to the first slide. So this is just basically what I'm going to talk through. So harmful views of mental disorder, helpful views of mental disorder. Topic for lots of different reasons. One is just intellectual. I think mental disorder, and by that I mean mental illness, so major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. I think that's just really interesting and can tell us a lot about how our minds work, how we can understand our relationship with God. And I also have a lot of personal experience with this issue, so mental disorder has been a big part of my life and the lives of a lot of loved ones. And in my capacity, working in churches and volunteering with different religious organizations, mental disorder and mental health is just something that's coming up increasingly with people, especially adolescents and young adults, but kind of people of many different ages. And it's something that repeatedly, in some instances, is pushing people outside of the church because of how they think the church either isn't addressing it, or when it does address it, it's doing so really harmfully. So church can make a really negative difference, but it can also make a really positive difference. Okay, so next slide, please. then seek out psychiatrists and like professional therapists when they have mental health concerns. So churches, religious organizations are often a first place that people go when these things come up for them. Also, religious people are just as susceptible to mental disorder. So it is true that different religious practices like going to church, participating in church communities, they can be really helpful for someone's mental health, but that doesn't mean that religious people are any less likely to develop a mental disorder. And then lastly, religion can play a huge role in how people experience and understand their mental disorder, right? Which makes sense. If your religious identity is a really important part of who you are, if you're experiencing mental disorder, that's going to play a really important, like, shaping role with how that goes on for you. All right, next slide, please. Okay. Oh, awesome. Thank you. Cool. Okay, so my research, I know this is kind of a lot, but basically in my research, I'm looking at the interaction between mental disorder, so things like depression, bipolar disorder, etc. So a big one is like religious community, right? This is one thing that I've found in a lot of interviews I've done that can either make a huge negative difference for people or can make a huge positive difference for people. And then some other things as well, like stories is something we'll talk about next week, like the really powerful role that people's personal firsthand accounts of their experience with mental disorder can play in shifting people's understanding of it. So that's kind of the big overlay, and I'm just going to be talking about like a particular slice of it. But so in our studies, we're looking at how people experience and how they understand these interactions. And so far, we've done over 400 like in-depth questionnaires with people and 70 in-depth interviews and counting. We're doing a study right now. If any of you want to join, you're more than welcome to. I know a couple people from Hope Church have done so already. And we're looking at, or the people we've interviewed, are people with mental disorder and significant experience with Christianity. And the way it's phrased this way is because we included a lot of people who currently faith altogether. But we still really wanted to capture them because they had a really important kind of experience to add to all of this. So it's people who've experienced both of these. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, thank you. Okay, so really broadly, there are kind of two harmful approaches to mental disorder that we saw emerging. And this is something that other people doing similar research have found as well. So on the one side, we see a big tendency to like over-spiritualize mental disorder. And by that, I mean people thinking that mental disorder is not really mental disorder. It's ultimately, it has like a spiritual cause and should have a spiritual treatment. So this view is something where people will say, you know, you have depression because you don't trust God enough, right? Or you have bipolar disorder because you have some unconfessed sin. You need to pray more, you need to read scripture more. That's how to deal with this issue. So that's what the over-spiritualizing view is. And here's a quote from a participant that kind of captures this. So they said, I've experience. Then on the other side, we have this approach of what I'm calling like denying spiritual meaning. So this is really interesting. I think some churches and some Christian individuals can see now really clearly the harms of this view. They're like, okay, it's really harmful to think a mental disorder is just a spiritual issue. We don't want to do that. and they kind of swing the pendulum all the way to the other side and say, okay, mental disorder, let's like push that outside the church, have people get professional treatment, which is really good, but then they just kind of push it outside and sever any interesting deep connections between someone's mental disorder and religion or spirituality. So here's kind of a fraught quote that I'll just mention here and we can talk about a little later. But one participant who had experienced psychosis, so that means like delusions and hallucinations, and that basically is like a hallucination is seeing something that's not there, right? So having a hallucination of a dead loved one, and a delusion is having like a really persistent belief, like, oh, I'm being persecuted by the government, I'm being followed by the government. That's kind of what we mean there. So this person had had experiences like that had a lot of religious content to them, which is pretty frequent, right? So they would say they were having hallucinations of God, delusions. So they said, part of the reason I lost my faith is because of what felt to me like hypocrisy in the church regarding my illness. I felt like on the one hand, you read, you believe in prophecy, you believe there's this other world, you believe all these things in the church. But then when somebody experiences them, you say, no, this is too far. This is not what we think, and there's no place for that. To me, it felt like there was no place for anything outside of, I don't know, like a very sedate version of Christianity or something. So there's a lot to unpack here that we'll bring up later, but the idea here is this person is saying, I'm having what I feel like are these real deep experiences of God in my mental disorder, and I'm bringing these to the church and they're completely shutting it down, right? They're saying, no, there's no spiritual import here. And what's really tricky about both these views is in some cases, both of these approaches are correct, right? So we might even say in this specific case, this approach is correct. What I mean by that is some people will have what they think are legitimate experiences of God telling them to do terrible things, right? People will have hallucinations or delusions of God telling them to kill someone, right? And we can pretty confidently say, like, no, that's not an experience of God. That's a mental disorder. We do want to shut down thinking that's like a legitimate spiritual interpretation. So that can be a good approach in some cases. And similarly with this approach, right, there are some cases, right, where someone might have persistent, unconfessed sin that is affecting them in a way that looks similar to like clinical depression, right? That's probably not as likely in cases when they've been diagnosed by a professional, but right, so we can see how in some cases these might be the correct approach. But the problem comes when either of these views are adopted in a really oversimplistic, overgeneralizing way that's not sensitive to specifics of the case, right? So it's problematic when someone just has a stance of thinking, in most or all cases of mental disorder, what's really going on here is a spiritual issue. And that's kind of the view that they have, in spite of indications to the contrary, and kind of vice versa. So these are two kind of extreme views that are often really harmful, and you find pretty frequently in Christian communities. And then another really interesting thing we found was people really citing pretty different sets of spiritual causes of mental disorder. So overall, people were much more likely to say that in their churches, they encountered views of like negative spiritual causes. So I'll just read through these quotes and kind of say which views they're showing. So one view, someone says, as someone who deals with anxiety, they were talking about themselves, often the sort of pushback is, well, you're anxious only because you don't trust God, you've given into a spirit of fear, and if you would just pray more or read God's word more, then you wouldn't be so anxious. If you really loved God, if you really believed in God's promises, if you really trusted God, you wouldn't feel this way. So this is a view that's kind of saying what you think is mental disorder is actually kind of one of the natural results of sin. So this is a view I kind of mentioned before, right? It's not really mental disorder. You're sinning in some way. You're not in right relationship with God. That's causing this mental disorder. Another view, so someone said, the message I got from my church and family got worse and worse about how they hoped that I would learn to change my life around because God was just waiting to have me be good and then I wouldn't be mentally ill anymore. So this view is kind of like a divine punishment view, where the idea is that God is punishing you in some way. That's why you're having these experiences of mental disorder. Another view, so someone said, after I was diagnosed with mental illness, the pastor that I had experienced during that time just really thought it was a spiritual attack. He thought depression is just a personal test that God's putting you through. That made me feel like it was my fault, like I was a big sinner, and that's why it was happening to me. So this view is like a spiritual attack view, right? The idea is that, okay, what looks like a mental disorder is actually the result of, like, in some cases, demonic forces attacking you, right? And then the last view, so someone explained, my Christian upbringing created endless worry, guilt, shame, fear, self-loathing, and so on. It kept me awake at night as a child with paralyzing worry. It was oppressive and rigid and devoid of the core light and love that should be felt in spiritual places. So this is kind of a view that some people mentioned, where they thought that their religious experiences, either of religious beliefs or harmful abuse by people within the church, had contributed to their mental disorder. So the overall idea of stuff on this slide is just, here are all the many different kind of negative spiritual causes that some people said, I've often been told that these are what are causing my mental disorder. And then there were also some instances of people bringing up positive or neutral spiritual causes, and these are pretty interesting too. So one person said, I thought my mental disorder was 100% spiritual. I thought I was being given a great gift, and I had been shown sort of like the other side of earth by God. I was taken in God's hand for some greater purpose. And then another person said, you can't tell where the illness begins and ends, and where you begin and end. And you know, although it caused a lot of pain, I wouldn't trade it. I would always want to be me because it made me a person who's sensitive to certain things and understands certain things in a new way. So it has been a great gift for me. So these are kind of expressions of positive views where their mental disorder is understood as kind of like a blessing from God or like some opportunity. And then there are also kind of more neutral views. So someone said, so in the sense that God is in control of everything, I think there's a sense in which God has allowed these symptoms, but I also don't think that I'm angry at God for my symptoms or anything like that. Like, I don't blame God for my symptoms. I think the idea is that he's changing me into a different kind of person as a result of the symptoms, and he's using these for that end. So overall, this is just kind of setting out like all the different sorts of spiritual views that people can have about what's going on in their mental disorder. And all of these different views can lead to pretty different experiences, right? So people's understanding can have a really powerful effect on how they experience their mental disorder. And the reason this is important is because the church and religious communities have a lot to offer with kind of working through some of these views, right? I think the church can play a really powerful role in recognizing we're not therapists, we're not supposed to be treating mental disorder, we're not supposed to be diagnosing mental disorder, but for so many people, theological ideas are so interwoven in how they're thinking about things, and those are things that the church can address. So here's just kind of like a little schematic capturing what I talked about so far, right? So the idea is one harmful view is like over-spiritualizing, saying it's all spiritual, right? And this often ends up denying the reality and pain of mental disorder. It often ends up blaming the individual and their spirituality, and it can lead to a lack of professional treatment, right? Because you're thinking it needs to be treated by things within the church. It can lead to increased shame, guilt, stigma, isolation. It can also lead to not really talking about it that much, right? You can see how if you think what depression really is unconfessed sin, then you talk about unconfessed sin, not depression, right? You talk about the root spiritual issue, and that can lead to just not really addressing mental disorder. And then on the other side, denying spiritual meaning, right? This can be harmful because it kind of denies someone the possibility of integrating their mental disorder with their faith, if both are really important parts of their experience and identity. It can also lead to a reduced ability to deal with the suffering. So talk about this more next time too, but like meaning making, basically taking negative experiences and being able to make sense of them in some way, draw some meaning out of them, is a super powerful way that we deal with suffering, not just from mental disorder, from all sorts of trauma and suffering. And so when you kind of cut that off for people, that can be really harmful for them. And then it can also lead to like a lack of agency and sometimes increased fear and stigma. So it's really interesting with this kind of denying spiritual meaning. Sometimes that can be in really overemphasizing the role of biological and genetic factors in mental disorder. And one thing that's fascinating was for a while, when there was like a lot of stigma surrounding mental disorder, people thought, okay, if we just teach people about the role of biological stuff and genetic factors in mental disorder, that will help lessen the stigma, right? But actually what they found is it lessens some elements of the stigma, but actually raises some other elements of the stigma, right? So you can see how if you think of someone's mental disorder as something that's just kind of hard-coded into them genetically, that can lead to the individual feeling like, oh, crap, I guess I can't really do much about this, right? It can lead to a sense of helplessness, and it can also lead to increased fear and stigma from other people, right? So the upshot is not we should ignore the role of biological and genetic factors, but it's just we should see those in the overall experience of the person and not do it in a way that kind of decreases their ability to have some power over it, right? I think sometimes people will maybe adopt the more spiritual view because they want to have some sense of control, right? Because they can think, okay, if this mental disorder is really due to my sin and my lack of right relationship with God, that's something I can try to address, right? And so I can try to help myself by doing that. So, lots of interesting things here, but this view can also lead to not talking about it, right? If you think there's no legitimate meaning to be drawn from someone's experience of mental disorder, you're not going to talk about it that much in church. Okay, and then in green, an integrated view can often be the most helpful and the most accurate, and you can kind of predict what this means. So, acknowledging non-spiritual causes, kind of counteracting this over-spiritualizing view. So saying, you know, biological, genetic, environmental, psychological factors, those are all playing a really important role in causing someone's mental disorder. So acknowledging non-spiritual causes, but then also emphasizing and like giving resources for spiritual meaning making and spiritual coping, not curing. So the idea is moving away from this binary of feeling like either it's all spiritual or it's not spiritual. Instead, this middle ground of saying, okay, might not be caused by spiritual things. God's not giving you a mental disorder, but there can still be really interesting spiritual things happening here and things that God can do with that mental disorder. Okay. And then, actually, I'm going to stop for a second. So, yeah, questions about what I've talked about so far? I know that was kind of a lot, but yeah.
So just remind us of your name and ask your question or make your comment.
I'm Dawn Bolkins. As I was listening to you read the lived experiences of people with mental illness, one of the things that was striking me was it seemed that as folks presented what their lived experience was, it seemed from a very fundamentalist theological stance. I wondered if, as you're interviewing people and having these conversations, if you're distinguishing among different theological streams, or if it's all in one pool.
Yeah, great question. So we definitely asked people about their denominational background when they were participating, but we haven't yet found any interesting differences. Like, we haven't found that these kinds of responses are popping up more for people who are identifying as having a fundamentalist background. And one really interesting thing that I'm kind of thinking through right now is it seems like even people who are coming from a church background that does not seem fundamentalist, they're still reporting these experiences, and sometimes it's things that are coming from the pulpit, but sometimes it's conversations and experiences they're having with individuals. And so there seems to be, like, even in churches or denominations that might have a more nuanced, informed view of this, there's still a lot of this kind of fundamentalist view in the water, which is important to address, right? Because it's like, on its face, certain churches might seem like they're really on the right track with this stuff, but there still might be plenty of people in the congregation who have a pretty fundamentalist view of these things. So, yeah.
My name is Bob Leidens. I found myself caught a moment ago, maybe about 15 minutes in, when you said something that really was fascinating, when you commented that in some instances folks will interpret their mental disorder as being God-caused, and then momentarily later you said, so there's a demonic potential interpretation. And what struck me in that is that there is the capacity that we have within the institutional church to meld the divine and the demonic, and therefore to create a picture of God, which is not a picture of one who is gracious, but indeed who is devil-like. And wondering whether or not that is something that you are hearing betrayed in some of the comments, that indeed what we would typically think of as a theologically encouraging image of God is one that is literally turned upside down into something that reflects an understanding of God as being like the devil, rather than one who is here to save us from the devil.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would say that definitely some people who were saying, I think God caused my mental disorder, there was a lot of anger and resentment there built up against God. And it did seem like some of the things they were attributing to God were really negative, potentially demonic features. So yeah, I hadn't thought about that before, but I think that is really interesting. And this is something that's like a very live conversation in work and theology on like disability, so like physical and intellectual disability and mental disorder, kind of like how we should understand God's role in bringing all of that about, and whether we think of the disorder or disability as something that's inherently negative or maybe not inherently negative. So that would have a big impact on whether we think of God causing this thing that's really negative. That might be leading to more of the demonic view, or potentially something that's neutral or positive that's just being mistreated in various ways. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's a really interesting question to think more about, though.
Kate, I'm wondering if your experience and knowledge as a philosopher gives you a perspective on or informs the work you're doing on religion and mental disorder.
Yeah, definitely. So this question gets brought up a lot, and one thing I always mention to my students, so I have a lot of like psychology and neuroscience students that take philosophy of mind with me and other classes, and one thing I say to them is, for some of you, the questions that got you interested in psychology and neuroscience are actually philosophical questions. You just didn't realize it. And I think that that's kind of the case with a lot of what I'm doing here. So like there's empirical work, like actually studying what people think, but then a lot of philosophical work is coming in to say, what do these findings mean? Like, what do they mean for how we're understanding how our mind works, or what our relationship with God is like? So I think that, and kind of thinking through what theories are kind of embedded in people's responses, that's all really philosophical. And also, too, like evaluating these theories. So that's something I'm going to talk about a little bit right now. But philosophy is all about taking theories and arguments and like testing them and seeing, are these good arguments? Are these relying on like shaky foundations or not? So I think that's a lot of where the philosophy is coming in, kind of like structuring things, if that makes sense.
Lance Engbers. I am interested in any kind of research that's been done in terms of people who have sought professional help and what that does to their relationship to the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a big question. I mean, I think, right, people have pretty different experiences. So one thing is sometimes people seeking out specifically Christian counselors, again, depending on whether that Christian counselor is one that tends towards an over-spiritualizing view. That can be pretty harmful. But one who's approaching it in like a really informed way. Like, I'm really informed about the religious beliefs going on, and I'm really informed about the biology and like environmental causes. That can be really helpful for people who experience mental disorder in kind of bringing this integration between the mental disorder and faith. But it can also be the case that professionals who are pretty resistant to religion playing a meaningful role, it can kind of have a harmful effect with people's relationship to the church or people's relationship to God. So it's really a mixed bag, but this is something too where within like the mental health community, there's increasing attention being paid to like, we really need to learn more about the role of religion and spirituality in all of this for people. So like, for example, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, they're like the biggest grassroots organization addressing mental illness, and they're not religious at all. And I've done some work with them, and they're starting this new initiative called FaithNet that's basically all about saying, not just Christianity, but religion in the US plays a huge role for people in how they experience their mental disorder. And we want to put a lot more energy towards like figuring that out and emphasizing that. So I think for some people it can be pretty harmful. And then on the flip side, right, like, so getting professional help in a way that's insensitive to religious stuff can be harmful, but also not getting professional help and just being treated within the church can also be really harmful, right? So it's like the ideal is kind of having both. That's definitely an important question. All right, so I'm going to go through these next couple slides, and then we'll have more time for questions and discussion at the end. So these are just a couple different things that I put up here, like how theological ideas that are true or that are drawn from Scripture can often be warped in some of these views that we were just talking about, right? And you could see this coming about in some people's quotes, right? So one is the idea that we shouldn't be anxious for anything, right? Or we shouldn't fear because God is with us. That's often, sometimes unintentionally warped and misinterpreted to mean if you have anxiety, right, especially in a persistent way, if you have clinical anxiety, then that means your faith isn't strong enough. Or if you're fearful, especially if you have heightened fears that might be a symptom of mental disorder, that means your faith isn't strong enough. Take every thought captive. That's something that's sometimes warped against people who have intrusive thoughts, which is a symptom of multiple mental disorders, right? If you have intrusive thoughts, you're not trying hard enough. And then the idea that we should rejoice always and pray without ceasing, that's often taken to mean, just rejoice more and God will take your depression away. Or it's interpreted to understand rejoice in a pretty flattened, kind of simplified way to mean, well, if you're rejoicing always, then you're always going to be really happy and you're not going to have negative emotions, right? So if you have negative emotions, that's a sign that you're not rejoicing always and praying without ceasing. And I think that's something, again, that philosophically and theologically we can really press on to say, that's the wrong understanding of rejoice, right? Rejoicing always is not something that's incompatible with this deeper kind of experience of emotions. And then a couple other views that are often coming from a good place. And I just presented at a conference that was all about kind of mental disorder and faith. And one of the talks was basically all about this idea. So people sometimes trying to reduce the stigma around mental disorder will say things like, everybody has mental health struggles. Everybody's a little crazy. At this conference, there was a talk by a reverend who was very well-meaning, maybe a little ill-informed about mental disorder, and it was all pushing this. Everybody has these concerns. Everybody struggles with this. And to a certain extent, that's true, right? We shouldn't think of people who experience mental disorder as experiencing this totally other alien thing, right? But taking this view can be really minimizing, right? Because it can say to the person, well, you think you have clinical depression, but actually everyone has these struggles, and the implicit message is just try a little harder, right? Because other people are able to deal with this. So it's important to recognize there's a connection there between everyday experiences and experiences of mental disorder, but with mental disorder, we are dealing with something unique that needs professional help that is not within the person's control to deal with. Kind of in a similar vein, like people will be trying to encourage, and they'll just give this kind of really simplified message of just pray and trust in God and he'll heal you. Or they might be trying to help and they'll say, oh, just let me pray for you, especially lots of instances of like a lack of consent for spiritual treatments or interventions for someone's mental disorder. And this is one of the things we saw a lot with people where it was extremely harmful for someone from the outside who didn't really have much of a personal relationship with someone to give these maybe well-intentioned but really simplified messages, right? It just communicated to the person, I'm minimizing your suffering, I think there should be a quick fix here, right? As opposed to like a much more nuanced version of this that actually might be true and really encouraging. Okay. And then, yeah, these are just kind of some quotes capturing this. So this is kind of capturing this like simplified view of rejoicing. So someone said the implicit message is that if you are in Christ and you are doing all the right things, then you will have joy. And joy means bubbling over with happiness. And if you pray about everything, then you won't feel anxious. And so for a long time, I really struggled with this. I thought there's something wrong with my faith. And I must not really be Christian, or I'm doing something wrong, or I'm failing in some way because I don't feel this bubbling over with happiness all the time. And I'm anxious even when I do all the right things. I'm feeling anxious about it, anxiety is still there, and so I think for many years I just felt like I had failed. I'm doing something wrong, God isn't in me because I'm still feeling anxious or sad or in despair. And another quote, I think that there's this tendency to not be vulnerable, to just pretend like everything is okay, because some Christian traditions associate being sick with being sinful. Like the reason that you are not doing well, mentally, physically, is because you're a bad person. You're sinning, you're going against God. So, these ideas in these quotes and kind of in the previous slide, I think what a lot of these are getting at are this view according to which someone's mental health is kind of a tracker for their spiritual health. And the idea is that if you're a true Christian, if you're doing things right, you'll have largely positive emotions, you won't have unstable emotions, and if you do have those in a persistent way, that's a sign that you're doing something wrong spiritually. And that's a really interesting kind of incorrect view of the role that emotions play in our life and the role that emotions play in our relationship to God. And it's interesting too because this person mentions like physical health and mental health here. And in a lot of ways, I think we can look at the work and movement that's taken place around physical and intellectual disabilities, right? So like blindness, deafness, Down syndrome, etc. There's been a lot of work around that in the church to say, okay, this view is clearly incorrect, right? Someone having these disabilities is not a sign that something is wrong between them and God. It's also not something we should take to stigmatize or kind of separate someone from the church in any way. And in fact, there are elements of that we need to embrace and recognize that people with those experiences have a really unique thing to bring to the church. There's been a lot of movement on that, and work on mental disorder in the church, I think, is like multiple steps behind that. But that's kind of the path forward for a lot of this stuff. And we can see in that how a lot of these views have really been dismantled and like addressed in church. But it still has a lot of staying power with mental disorder, right? Because there are really unique things about mental disorder, namely that it's taking place in the mind, right? So it has a much closer, kind of trickier connection to like religious beliefs or how we understand our relationship with God. And then just briefly, like these views of mental disorder, they're not just important because they shape how people think about their mental disorder, but like I've been saying, they also shape how people experience their mental disorder, right? So the view of mental disorder you have, it can powerfully shape, what you pay attention to, how much you pay attention to it, the weight you give to different elements of your experience, and how you interpret it. So for example, some of the views I talked about, like either viewing mental disorder from the get-go as something positive or negative or neutral and mixed, it can impact like what you see as possible for your experience. So for example, a lot of people view mental disorder as something that's inherently negative, the result of some kind of malfunction or breakdown, or, God gave this to you, it's an effective sin, like all of these negative views. And that can really narrow someone's view in whether they think there might be any positive meaning that comes out of it. So one thing we saw from some participants when we were asking them about, do you think there have been any positive things that have come out of your mental disorder? Some participants said, I don't know what you're talking about. This question doesn't make any sense. One participant even emailed us to say, I just want to let you know you have a typo on half of your whole questionnaire because you're asking about positive effects of mental disorder, and that's clearly impossible. So, you should address that. And to be clear, some people might never experience any positive effects of mental disorder, and that's not due to any issue with them. That's not anything that is their fault. But I think that these statements that I just mentioned from participants, those statements indicate people, some of them aren't even open to the possibility. Like they can't even conceptualize that possibility. And that can really shut down those things from happening. So that's one reason why these views are important. And then also, too, what you think the cause of your mental disorder is, right? If you think the cause is you in some way, or God, or some supernatural thing, or your genetics, that can impact how you think it should be treated, right? It can also impact where you think the power lies and where you think the blame lies, right? So if you think the cause is you in some way, one positive thing might be you have an increased sense of power and ability to say, okay, well, the problem is me, so then that means I can try to fix it. But then a big negative effect is it leads to a lot of self-blame and stigma and shame, right? So all this to say, the view that you have of these things is really important for your experience. And it can be tricky to figure out the correct view in many cases because different mental disorders can undermine the very capacities that you might use to get to the correct view of things, right? Because it can impair your emotional processes, your thinking processes, right? And then also, too, like I mentioned, the content of some symptoms of mental disorder is often religious. Like delusions and hallucinations especially, there is often religious content in these things. And that can make it really tricky to think through cases like the one I mentioned earlier, or this quote, too. So someone said, the content of my psychosis, so again, delusions and hallucinations, the content of my psychosis was that it seemed to be God. But as soon as you medicate it away, then it's no longer there. And then it starts to feel like, well, what I thought was God was really chemicals, biological. And so it became very difficult to hold on to the sense that that was real or meaningful in a spiritual sense. The thing was that the experience that I had was an experience of total communion with God, so I no longer have that because of it. So this quote is not to say that this person should not have been medicated. Maybe they should have been medicated. That might have been the best thing for them. But I think that this really sharp change this person went through of I'm having these experiences of mental disorder and I feel so close to God. And then I take this medication and I go through treatment and that goes away. That big swing and that gap there, again, I think is where the church can really come in and give some deeper sense of how to make meaning around this, even when someone experiences, their experience changes a lot because they're going through treatment. There's a way for the church and kind of theology to step in and say, okay, you're no longer experiencing this psychosis because that might have been the result of mental disorder, but there are still all these ways you can think through this experience in a meaningful way that's tying it in with your relationship with God, with your sense of religious identity. So, yeah, I definitely want to talk more about these kinds of quotes, and we can talk more about that next time too, but just kind of flagging it as these are the kinds of cases that make getting to the correct view of mental disorder really tricky because religion is bound up in there in a much more intimate way. And just one more slide. So some of the practical highlights of research that I just think are important to flag. So some of the things I've been saying from my research, right, like churches at the very least should be addressing it more frequently and more in depth. They should also recognize the underlying beliefs about the person, about God, that are kind of motivating these views of mental disorder. And especially, they should really emphasize the importance of potentially making spiritual meaning out of experiences without moving to thinking there's a spiritual cause there. And then a couple other things from other research is, one idea is this idea of responsibility without blame. So this is a really important idea that's basically saying, with mental disorder, it's important to maintain someone's sense of responsibility, which means their sense of like, they can do something to change their situation. They can take active steps, but separating that from the idea of blame, or they're at fault when they're especially struggling or struggling to take some of these active steps. Another important idea is using person-first language, and so that means saying someone who struggles with depression or someone who experiences depression as opposed to depressed person, right? As opposed to schizophrenic, person with schizophrenia, right? Because what that does is it separates the person from the mental disorder and says, this disorder is not dictating who they are as a person, which is what can happen when you put the disorder or the disability first, right? This is the same thing, too, with like a move from deaf person to a person who experiences deafness. And then another thing that I'll talk especially about next time is like in-person interactions and personal stories with people who have experienced mental disorder is one of the most powerful ways to combat stigma and misunderstanding, more so than presenting facts, more so than giving people really well thought out arguments. It's kind of all about people's experiences and talking about that authentically, and especially in a really messy way, or allowing it to be messy and vulnerable. And what I mean by that is like having these overly kind of triumphant, nice, neat packaged stories can be helpful, but they can also be kind of harmful and isolating, right? Because if you have someone up front and the only stories they're hearing are like, I had depression and I was in the depths of despair and then God saved me and now I'm in this great place. That might be true, but if that's all someone hears, then they think, well, that's not where I'm at. I don't know if that's even possible for me given how terrible I feel. Like, where's the path forward, right? And so it's especially important to have really messy and vulnerable stories, people who are still in the midst of it, kind of put from up front or shared as well. And then digging into specifics is really important as well, right? Like not just addressing mental disorder in a kind of overly shallow way or a way that melds it into everyday experience too much, right? Saying, oh, well, everyone experiences anxiety, and here's how we should think about it, or everyone experiences down days, right? That can be important, but it's also really important to dig into, like, here are some specific disorders and symptoms, and let's dig into how we should think about these theologically. Okay, so that's it. This is just a summary of what I mentioned, and I'm going to talk about the impact on, like, individual faith and individual stories next time. And then here's just some of my information. So I want to hear questions and other thoughts people have.
I'm David Alexander, and I was struck by when you had a list of 7 things, and people say, and it was basically short, pithy statements from Scripture.
Yeah.
And as I looked at that slide, I thought how unhelpful it is. The first 4 were short, pithy statements from Scripture, and I thought how unhelpful it is to diagnose a big thing with 6 words from a verse somewhere. And how, as a Christian, probably the most dangerous Christian I've ever been is a guy with a verse. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And this is the thing, like, when people would recount harmful experiences they have had in their churches, it was that. It was someone thinking they were being helpful, but just kind of throwing out this verse at them and thinking, okay, that's going to help them, right? As opposed to doing the really difficult work of like digging into what it theologically means, what it might mean for their experience, and how it's not just this short, pithy idea. So definitely.
Thank you. Larry Schuyler. Have to tell you about a conversation I've had in the last month. It's a person I hadn't seen for a long time approached me and sat down, and she was very happy and overflowing and said, I got to tell you, have you been to this conference? And I had, I've had the Satan cast out from me. And so I'm just happy and at peace. The anger that I've had is gone. And I'm thinking, okay, here's a person whose husband had a stroke and also losing memory, who's living at home with her, a son who is a star person in her life now with PTSD and went to alcoholism and institutionalized, a son who's been in prison. I mean, this person has a whole lot of reason to be unhappy and finds herself at this point praising Jesus, just and happy. I haven't heard you talk much about the idea with Satan, demon possessed, that concept as part of one's mental health. What is your research showing about that?
Yeah, so here, I mean, so we definitely did have some participants who talked about this. So some participants especially who said, like, I went to a church where they, performed an exorcism of sorts on me without my consent, and that was really harmful to me, right? So some people were coming from places where, like, that idea of demon possession at the core of mental disorder was really prominent. But I will say, I think that in some sense is a bit of a minority view, especially in like Western Christianity. But I think it's especially tricky, and maybe people will disagree with me, but I think it's especially tricky because in Western Christianity, we are just way less interested in talking about demonic supernatural forces. And that's something that in other parts of the world, like I've had multiple missionary friends in other parts of the world where that idea of demon possession is like something they need to talk about, something they feel like more of their everyday experiences are kind of in line with, the role of the supernatural in everyday life. So all that to say, demon possession is something that's been way overused and again used to minimize the true effects of mental disorder in a lot of cases. But again, I don't think it's always false. Like I think there are cases of demon possession. But it's important to kind of separate those and, in a sense, leave those to the experts in those areas, if that makes sense. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I want to think more about that.
So a comment and a question. As an illustration of person-first language, I can tell you that the Hearing Loss Association of America would never refer to somebody as hearing impaired, but rather as a person with hearing loss.
Yeah.
My question is a little bit longer. At the beginning, you referred to, or you alluded to the increase in kind of psychological disorders in the culture. And this has been dramatically true among younger Americans, teens and people under 25. 8% suffered major depressive disorder during the past year in the year 2010. In 2020, according to the government and confirmed by other sources, that had doubled to about 16%, while midlife adults had some increase in rates of mood disorders. People over 50 were flat. They're basically resilient. So there's a really interesting and dramatic phenomenon that needs explanation. So my question is going to be if you have any thoughts about that. But let me just seed your thinking on that or with just one more comment, and that is, in my field of psychological science, the debate around this, what's happening to explain this dramatic increase in how miserable younger Americans are, particularly teen girls, but not just teen girls, has centered on the explosion of smartphones during this same era and the social comparisons that social media enables. It makes it look like everybody else is having more fun, and the time sucked by 4 hours a day or more on screen, which means you have less face-to-face relationships and less sleep and less of a lot of other part of life. But listening to you, Kate, makes me think there is one other trend that's happened that bears upon younger Americans during this same 10-year period that's been such a dramatic change. And that is the dramatic rise in people under 25, 18 to 25, who in Pew surveys of Americans say they have no religious affiliation. Among 18 to 25-year-olds, that's almost 50% now. And so my question, that was a long question, but my question is, do you have any thoughts about what explains this dramatic rise in mood disorders among younger Americans? And does the increase in kind of irreligiosity have any bearing or any connection to that? And by the way, we've just finished 4 weeks talking about the kind of toxic politicization of evangelicalism and its associations with Christianity, which has been a real negative PR campaign for the faith among younger Americans.
Yeah. So there's a lot in that question. I think that with regard to the religious element, I mean, it's interesting because, right, like because religion can have positive mental health benefits, specifically in like getting really connected in a community, believing in something greater than yourself, like young people having less of that definitely has a negative effect on mental health. But I also think that for the number of teenagers and young adults that I've personally known for whom that might be something going on, there's also just as many where for them, at least leaving their particular church or denomination was the right call for their mental health because it had had such a negative effect on them in terms of how people around them were viewing their personality attributes, especially their like sexuality. Like there were just all sorts of really negative kind of condemning views that were coming at them from their religious community that were extremely harmful. And so I think it's really difficult because again, it's like Christianity and the church community can just be a huge difference maker positively or negatively. So the real question is not like religion in general, but maybe like specific churches or specific denominations can kind of move things really positively or negatively. So I guess religion is probably a huge part of this story, but it's a really complicated part of the story where it's not just leaving churches causing this increase. And then also too, just on the question of like causes of this increase, like a lot of philosophical work kind of says there are 3 potential things to look at. Like one is just that society in general is causing more mental disorder, right? The way things are fractured, social media, there's just more people with mental disorder. Another view is because the stigma is so lessened, there are maybe the same number of people with mental disorder, but people are more willing to come forward and get help. And another view is like the diagnosis and kind of criteria that are used have changed. And so maybe it's larger, so more people are being diagnosed. And I think that the correct story is probably all 3 of those elements are playing some role. And I do think that like with a lot of teenage girls that I've spent time with in ministry groups, like I'm so thankful that I did not grow up in the age that they're growing up because I can just see viscerally like the way that things go socially for them and social media does have a really harmful effect on them. So anyways, yeah, a lot more to say there, but we're also at time. So.
Yeah. Any final comments or question from anybody?
Yeah, this is fantastic. Sorry I'm not going to be here next week, but really appreciate just the lens at which you're looking at this and how it connects to the church. I'm wondering, is there something you've already learned from this most recent research that you didn't already know?
Yeah. I feel like I've learned a lot. It's kind of like hard to articulate it in short statements. I mean, a lot of what I learned, I think, was what I mentioned here. I think one thing I've learned is just like the power that is held in people's stories. Like one thing I just learned from reading through these interview transcripts and doing these interviews is just how much of an impact they had on me, even being someone who's done a lot of research on this topic. There was just something coming through in people sharing so vulnerably about their stories, like some of the deepest moments of their life that were like, oh, this right here is changing how I'm understanding God and the possibilities there. So I think the story stuff is one of the biggest things. But I think, too, it was also really encouraging to see some of the really positive stories around how people's religious communities have come alongside them in mental disorder. And I hadn't seen or experienced as much of that firsthand. So yeah, those are two of the things, but definitely a lot.
Thank you very much, Kate. We here at Hope Church do think about caring for the health and well-being of our members. We have a Hope Church nurse, and to think about mental health as part of the larger health picture is something for us to think more about, I think, and you've kind of raised that for us, and to think about how people's either warped or grace-filled supportive ideas, theological ideas, intersect with their emotions and their moods is another thing that gives us food for thought. I regret that I'm going to be in Seattle next weekend, but Jane Schuyler is going to be hosting Kate next week, and we look forward to you all back for the completion. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks.